So the topic of this short lecture is the United States Committee on Public Information during World War I. Let's get into it. So, when World War I gets going for the United States in April of 1917, around that time, you have an effort on the part of the government to get information out to the public on the importance of why the war is being fought, why America is entering the war, and why it's important for all Americans, if possible, to be actively involved in the prosecution of the conflict and on the home front in terms of marshaling resources. So to that end, there is created what becomes known as the U.S. Committee on Public Information. Now, that is going to be led by a journalist by the name of George Creel. Now, this is also called the Creel Committee. Now, Creel, and more specifically, those kind of leading, this effort, didn't necessarily see what they were doing as we might see it today, which is propaganda, or they had a different definition of what they considered propaganda to be, as we might look at it within the context of the 21st century. Now, it's propaganda. Okay, so the idea is, and the phrase that was used by the CPI, which is the acronym for this, is that they were going to be what they called the mouthpiece of democracy, right? So this is a quote from a speech from the CPI, and particularly what were called the 4-Minute Men, which was an organization kind of related to this, which I'll mention in a minute. Okay, so we got George Creel. We got this idea of wanting to get out information to the public about the war and about how it's important to support the war and kind of ways in which you can support the war. All right, so how do you do that then, right? So it's 1917, it's 1918. Print news was a thing in 1917, 1918. So the idea would be that you would want to cultivate favorable press sort of networks to be able to publish stories, to print information, to include advertisements for kind of local wartime resource marshaling, right? That would be something you'd want to get out. And then again, specifically another way you would want to do this with this idea of, again, not just the CPI, but disseminating information to the public. It's going to be the 4-Minute Men. Right, so the 4-Minute Men is going to be an organization that exists really across the country, and it's going to be run by different groups in different spaces. And the goal of the 4-Minute Men was to be able to convey information directly to the public, where the public was at, about the war. So it could be updates on new programs, on resources, on pushes for fundraising, for bonds, right? This kind of loans, this kind of thing. And again, it's going to be where the public's at. So the title of it was 4 minutes, with the assumption being that that would kind of be the amount of time between when a film would be changed over in a theater. But 4-Minute Men spoke really in generally most public spaces that you can think of. They would be asked to come speak. They would go in and speak. And the statements or the things that they spoke on varied based on the time period of the war. So as certain programs were coming in, with the desire being to let the public know perhaps more about it, there was a certain level of flexibility in what the individuals could say or they could speak about, but they usually had to be related to these kinds of speeches. They had to obviously be very pro-war, and in many cases, of course, these would occur in a number of different circumstances and to different communities and that kind of thing. In some cases, state councils of defense are going to be involved in really kind of operating these programs, kind of on behalf of national authorities. Another way that you would get your information out to the public at this point is going to be billboards, it's going to be posters, and again, it's going to be advertisements. But the poster really is going to be a primary key medium for you to be able to get out information and imagery specifically to the public in 1917 and 1918. So in public spaces around America, particularly in towns and cities, you would see posters that would be supported or paid for either by the CPI or other organizations, where the goal is, again, to disseminate this information and to get it out there. Now, the individuals putting it out there are often going to be state and particularly local individuals who, are able to get a hand to get some of this material, and then they're going to be the ones to basically to distribute it. So again, those state councils in some cases, or women's committees in some cases, are going to have a big role to play with a lot of that. Now, another aspect of this is going to be film. All right, it's going to be film. So silent films, particularly short silent films, would be produced in the war, for the war, under the auspices of this. The best example of this is going to be one called Pershing's Crusaders. And the goal of these kinds of films, again, is to support the mission of the war, sort of this why are we fighting? And in the case of Pershing's Crusaders, really making this connection between the American Expeditionary Force led by General Pershing and the sort of Crusader Knights of centuries upon centuries before. Now, another aspect of this process is how do you distribute these? So a good example would be you could have showings of these films. You would usually have to coordinate that with area CPI offices or state council offices or other offices, and they would be shown in theaters. There would be certain what were called Liberty theaters, where the goal was to be able to promote things. Another aspect of this, again, around public spaces in which information or imagery could be disseminated, is what's called sort of expositions. So the Committee on Public Information would support a series of wartime expositions in major cities like Chicago, but also in other cities around the United States, particularly in 1918. Now, this grew out of a public culture of fairs, World's Fairs, and expositions that existed in the United States for a few generations prior to the First World War. So there was this tradition or culture of going to a fair or going to an expo. And so you have individuals during the war who figured the use of that space would be a great place in which the government could control how messaging and how information about the war and about ways the public can get involved will be disseminated to individuals. So the CPI would sponsor a lot of this. They have different divisions that are going to sponsor a lot of this. But it's often going to be up to the states and to state councils and to a series of volunteer organizations to really, again, coordinate this at the state and local level. So it's not singularly just the CPI, but they're going to be sponsoring a lot of what will eventually come there. It'll be done under their auspices. But again, local folks really have a central role to play in all of these expositions. So there's a very large one in Los Angeles. There's one in Chicago, and a few other places as well. And you get, in some cases, tens of thousands of individuals showing up here. And it really, again, is a kind of catch-all of all kinds of government programming and private organizations and volunteer organizations kind of coming together and showing off the many, many, many ways in which so many different resources and so many different programs and activities are now war measures or sort of ways in which you can support the war. Really anything from forms of food conservation to joining the service to really just about anything that you can think of, including new initiatives for the support of children's health and care for infants as well in the U.S. Thank you very much.